September 19th, 1871. Betty of Montgomery. They whispered her name in Montgomery like it was a curse. Betty, an enslaved woman whose vengeance dripped not from a blade nor from fire, but from a poison hidden in the most forbidden place. 11 men, her master among them, never saw it coming, and history, terrified of what it revealed, tried to bury her story deeper than any grave. Now you have to understand, this wasn't just another tale of rebellion in a world soaked in chains and blood. This was something more intimate, more grotesque, more ingenious than any overseer, judge, or historian dared to write down without trembling. Betty turned her body, the very sight of her oppression, into a weapon. She carried death where no one thought to look, where no man of power could resist intruding, and with that single, horrifying strategy, she toppled the hierarchy of a plantation with silence, not fire. Imagine the fear when men, untouchable men, began to collapse one by one, poisoned by the intimacy they believed was theirs to own. Welcome, seekers of shadows, to Echoes of Truth, the gathering place for those brave enough to peer into history's darkest corners. Tonight, we walk together into a story so chilling, so taboo, that it survived only in fragments, whispers, and forbidden testimonies. Betty Peter, the enslaved woman who made her body a vessel of revenge, who killed her master and 10 of his most brutal overseers in Montgomery. But I have to ask, do you have the courage to uncover what really happened? To hear how oppression twisted into something unspeakable, yet undeniable? If so, I want you to subscribe, and in the comments, tell us where you're listening from. Because when you speak up, you join this investigation. I want you to picture this. Montgomery, early 1800s. The air was heavy with humidity, thick with the stench of sweat, molasses, and blood baked into wooden beams of the plantation houses. The cotton fields stretched like endless seas of white under a burning sun. But for the enslaved who bent their backs from dawn until dusk, there was no beauty in it, only torment. Overseers barked orders, their whips snapping through the air, tearing skin and dignity alike. Nights carried a different kind of silence, punctured only by the moans of exhausted bodies collapsing onto dirt floors. This was the stage on which Betty lived, a world built to crush spirit and erase identity. To most outsiders, Montgomery was a prosperous southern jewel, a hub of wealth and civility. But step behind the polished facades, and you'd find a world so cruel that survival itself became an act of quiet rebellion. Her master was a man the community respected, a landowner, wealthy and charming at church socials, a benefactor of Southern tradition. But now, you have to understand, respectability was his mask, not his truth. Behind the plantation gates, his cruelty was legendary. His punishments were not about discipline, but about domination, a performance of power. The overseers, 10 in total, were cut from the same cloth, men who relished their authority. They strutted through the quarters with boots that carried fear on their heels. They were the kind who smiled in daylight, but whispered threats in the dark. To the townsfolk, they were protectors of order, guardians of prosperity. But to Betty and those who shared her chains, they were predators. Men who saw black bodies as nothing more than tools, toys, and property. These were not faceless villains. They were men of influence, men no one dared question, until Betty did. Let's be real. Every crime, no matter how monstrous, needs its disguise. For Betty's master and his overseers, the cover story was simple: civilization itself. They cloaked their violence in the rhetoric of duty, insisting they were maintaining order, protecting investments, ensuring the prosperity of Montgomery. When bruises and scars appeared, they were discipline. When women bore children after midnight visits, it was nature. When a man collapsed from exhaustion, it was God's will. The public consumed these lies easily, because it was easier than facing the truth. Even in death, explanations were prepared: disease, fever, accidents, bad harvest luck. And here's where it gets chilling. The same system that murdered daily without poison had built such a believable mask. No one could imagine the deaths of 11 powerful men might come from a woman they considered powerless. That's how the conspiracy of silence began. But beneath the polished justifications lay a machine, an infrastructure designed not just for profit, but for subjugation. The plantation itself was a fortress of oppression. Overseers rotated shifts like soldiers, guarding fields and quarters. Records were kept with the cold precision of an accountant. Names, births, punishments, deaths. Carts carried not just cotton, but bodies too weak to walk. The master's house loomed at the center, a grotesque symbol of authority, its columns gleaming white while screams echoed from its shadows. Now you have to understand, slavery wasn't chaos. It was organized, calculated, enforced with ritual. Whips hung in plain sight, dogs were trained to track escapees, and alliances with local sheriffs ensured fugitives were dragged back, often half dead. This machine was meant to be unbreakable. Yet inside this fortress, Betty found a crack, small, intimate, invisible to the naked eye. And from that fissure, she planned her silent rebellion. When things went wrong on plantations, and they always did, there was a script ready. Overseers found dead from unexplained illness, fever, a master weakened by sudden vomiting, bad oysters, strange powders discovered in the kitchen, spilled medicine. The plantation elite had mastered the art of denial. They dismissed suspicion with polished speeches and false confidence, so much so that even when rumors trickled through the quarters, they were quickly snuffed out. Nothing unusual here, the officials would say, their voices lined with authority. But here's the unsettling truth. The very eagerness to explain away anomalies kept Betty safe, at least for a while. Her method of killing slid perfectly into the cracks of their excuses. Death looked natural, sickness looked ordinary, and that is what made her weapon so terrifying. It was invisible, undetectable, and inseparable from the very intimacy they assumed they owned. No crime of this magnitude happens in isolation, and though Betty's hand carried the poison, whispers suggest she may not have acted entirely alone. In the shadows of the quarters, there were allies, another enslaved woman who whispered recipes of deadly herbs, or perhaps a house servant who slipped her the vials, small enough to hide where no overseer dared search. Some accounts hint at a doctor, sympathetic but cautious, who looked the other way when unusual symptoms appeared. Now, you have to understand, the collaborator didn't need to touch the poison to be guilty. Their crime was silence, assistance, or maybe just pretending not to notice. History doesn't name them, and perhaps that anonymity was their survival. But make no mistake, someone helped Betty, if only by protecting her secret until the bodies began to fall. In conspiracies, this dangerous complicity often looks like courage. The 11 men Betty killed were not nameless overseers lost to history. They had families, reputations, and authority. The master was a pillar of Montgomery society, admired at markets and churches, a man whose death would ripple far beyond the plantation gates. The overseers were rough men, but they were trusted. Their children bore their names. Their wives depended on their wages. They lived with the swagger of untouchables, confident their positions gave them immunity from consequence. But here's what history tends to forget. These men built their lives on the torment of others. Every scar on Betty's back, every child ripped from their mother's arms, every woman violated in the night, all of it was written in their hands. Their deaths, though shocking to polite society, looked very different from the perspective of those who suffered beneath them. To Betty, they weren't guardians of order. They were her executioners in waiting. And then, as in all stories like this, there was a witness, someone who stumbled onto truth by mistake. Accounts differ, but one story speaks of a young enslaved boy, tasked with cleaning the master's chamber, who noticed something strange. A vial, small and hidden, carelessly left beneath bedding. Others whisper of an overseer's wife, suspicious of her husband's sudden sickness, who pieced together whispers from the quarters and connected them to Betty's presence. Whoever they were, their discovery carried immediate danger. Because in a world this tightly controlled, to witness truth was a crime in itself. If the boy spoke, he risked the whip, or worse. If the wife accused, she risked disbelief or exposure herself. In conspiracy, witnesses don't just observe, they become targets. And in Betty's story, the accidental witness would ignite the unraveling, forcing secrets into daylight where silence could no longer protect them. Now, you have to understand, being a witness in this world was not a privilege. It was a curse. The boy who glimpsed the vial, if we accept his version, was thrust into a silence heavier than chains. Imagine his terror, too young to grasp the fullness of what he'd seen, yet old enough to sense its danger. If he spoke, he risked being accused of complicity. If he stayed silent, the weight of truth would rot inside him. Some say he tried to warn another enslaved elder, only to be beaten for imagining stories. Others suggest he whispered to an overseer's wife who dismissed him as a foolish child. Trauma became his inheritance. And here's the sinister brilliance of Betty's plot. The very absurdity of her method ensured denial. Who in polite Montgomery would dare believe that an enslaved woman carried poison in her intimate parts? The horror was so grotesque, so unthinkable, that people dismissed it outright. To believe was to admit that the system had vulnerabilities, and that was far too dangerous. Of course, deaths of powerful men demanded an inquiry. Montgomery's elites gathered with stern faces, determined to preserve the illusion of order. Physicians were called, but their diagnoses echoed the script: fever, tainted food, swamp-borne disease. Coroners scribbled notes, but their ink was shaped by fear, not truth. And you have to picture this: a room of white men, sipping brandy, debating causes while 11 coffins cooled in the earth. They couldn't allow poison to be the answer, for poison suggested intent, and intent suggested rebellion. To admit that an enslaved woman orchestrated such vengeance would crack the entire foundation of control. So they cloaked themselves in plausible deniability. The inquiry became a performance, a spectacle of concern designed to fail. Unfortunate accidents, they declared, tragic timing, and with those words, they buried the truth deeper than the men themselves. But whispers don't die so easily. Not every man Betty targeted died. Some lingered, survivors who became unwilling monuments to her revenge. Their bodies bore the evidence in grotesque ways: tremors in their hands, teeth yellowed from the toxin's grip, stomachs twisted in perpetual agony. And here's the thing: these changes were undeniable. In hushed tones, townsfolk noted how the overseer who once strutted with arrogance now stumbled like a drunk. How another, once robust, withered into a husk before their eyes. These men, though still alive, were shadows of themselves. Their reputations corroded along with their health. And yet, official records never admitted the cause. Instead, they framed it as weakness, God's punishment, or degeneration of spirit. The cruelty was twofold. Betty had stripped their bodies of power, while society stripped them of dignity by refusing to name the truth. Living evidence walked among Montgomery, and every step they took was an unspoken testimony of her defiance. This is where the story gets truly chilling. What exactly did Betty use? Whispers point to a blend of herbs known among enslaved communities, roots and leaves passed down from African knowledge, recipes whispered like forbidden scripture. Some say it was oleander, others suggest powdered arsenic smuggled from the master's own stores. But the real horror was not the substance, it was the method. Betty hid the poison inside her body, a place so intimate, so taboo, that no overseer would think to search, and no master could resist violating. Each encounter became a transaction of death. Every touch, every act of forced intimacy carried with it a silent payload. Now, you have to understand, the genius of this was not just the concealment, it was the inversion. Betty turned the site of her greatest violation into the weapon of her greatest rebellion, and with that act she shattered the illusion of absolute power. Now you have to understand, every story of buried truth needs someone reckless enough to dig. In Betty's tale, the hero is less a savior and more an obsessive. A young abolitionist, let's call him Thomas Reed, who drifted into Montgomery under the guise of a traveling preacher. He wasn't noble in the saintly sense. He carried debts, scars, and a hunger for redemption. But he had something the plantation elite feared: a restless curiosity. Rumors of sudden deaths had reached him through underground networks, carried by whispers from enslaved men who risked everything to share fragments of Betty's story. Thomas was flawed, stubborn, prone to arrogance, but what set him apart was his refusal to look away. He had seen too much cruelty in the slave markets, too much despair in the fields, and when he heard Betty's name spoken like a curse, something inside him refused to let it go. Heroes, after all, are rarely clean. They're simply the ones who can't stop asking dangerous questions. I want you to picture this. Thomas walking the streets of Montgomery by day, charming locals with sermons about morality, while by night he slipped into slave quarters, pressing for details. He listened more than he spoke, collecting pieces like shards of broken glass. One elder woman spoke of Betty's defiance, how she carried herself with a quiet intensity. Another whispered of men who fell sick after visiting her, their eyes hollowing within days. Bit by bit, Thomas stitched together a tapestry of suspicion. He even bribed a local doctor for access to records where he saw a pattern of sudden fevers clustered around Betty's encounters. Each lead was a thread pulling him deeper, but every discovery came with risk. Overseers had eyes everywhere. A stranger asking too many questions could vanish overnight. Yet Thomas pressed forward, his own fears swallowed by the growing certainty that Betty's story was real and far more explosive than anyone dared admit. And this, dear listener, is where I turn to you. Can you handle what comes next? Because from here, the story stops being rumor and begins to bleed with proof. We've walked through whispers, denials, and grotesque transformations, but the evidence Thomas uncovered would peel back the mask entirely. Ask yourself, if you were in his place, would you have the courage to press on, knowing discovery could mean death? Or would you bury what you found, like so many before him? Now, you have to understand, the next revelation is not just chilling, it is devastating. So if you've made it this far, don't turn away. Because Betty's method, her evidence, her defiance, it's about to come into full, unflinching light. Stay with me, because this is where the story turns truly chilling. Thomas's breakthrough came in the form of something so small, so ordinary, that most people would have brushed past it without a second glance. It wasn't gold or a weapon or even a letter written in a trembling hand. It was a vial, no larger than a thumb, half buried in the packed dirt floor of a slave cabin. The glass, once clear, had clouded over with age, its surface scratched and dulled by years underground. The cork that sealed it had long since degraded, its edges frayed and crumbling, but the contents inside remained, clinging stubbornly to the glass. A faint dust, a powder whose odor was sharp and unmistakable, whispered of something sinister: bitter almonds, arsenic, death itself, waiting in silence. Later accounts insist that Thomas found more than just that vial. There were scraps of cloth, worn and stained, bearing traces of herbs that had been ground, soaked, and pressed into them. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like little more than rags, forgotten and useless. But to anyone who had lived in the cabins, to anyone who knew the secret language of survival, those scraps were tools, instruments carefully prepared and tucked away with the patience of someone who knew the power they held. And here lies the chilling truth. These items weren't keepsakes or trophies from past deeds. They were not remnants of vengeance already carried out. No, they were implements of work still unfinished, relics of a campaign that had not yet reached its end. The discovery struck Thomas like a thunderclap. For years, whispers of Betty's vengeance had lingered, half believed, half dismissed as fevered rumor or the imagination of frightened men. But now, for the first time, there was something that could not be argued away. It was no longer only symptom or story. It was evidence, solid, tangible. The vial, the cloth, the herbs, they transformed whispers into reality. Imagine holding that fragile glass between your fingers, knowing it was the very same instrument that had ended 11 lives, the same weapon hidden in plain sight where no master dared stoop to search. Thomas knew immediately what this meant. Proof was not a luxury. Proof was perilous. Proof demanded choice: silence or revelation, complicity or justice. In that moment, He understood that the path before him was no longer his to wander freely. It had been drawn in the dirt alongside the vial, sharp and narrow, and whether it led to justice or to doom, he had already begun to walk it. But discovery, no matter how carefully buried, never remains secret for long. Rumors are living things. They crawl, they slither, they slip beneath doors and through cracks until they find ears eager to hear them. Word of Thomas's digging spread in whispers, curling toward the overseers who still lingered on the plantation. These were men already haunted by paranoia, their nerves frayed, their tempers quick to snap. In the wake of so many unexplained deaths, they were hunting desperately for a culprit, someone, anyone, on whom they could lay the weight of fear. And when they heard Thomas had unearthed something in the cabins, their suspicion sharpened like a blade. One night, cloaked by a moonless sky, Thomas tried to act. He wrapped the vial in cloth, pressing it tight against his chest, and slipped from the cabin as silently as he could. But the silence betrayed him. Somewhere in the dark, a watcher stirred. Soon, the still night erupted with noise. Shouts carried across the fields. Torches flared like angry stars. Boots thundered against the earth, and dogs unleashed their guttural snarls. The chase had begun. Picture it. A lone figure, clutching fragile glass in trembling hands, running across the very fields where cries of the enslaved had echoed for generations. His breath came ragged, his heart pounded in his ears, every step a gamble between flight and collapse. Behind him, the overseers and their hounds drove forward with ruthless precision, voices laced with both fury and terror. To them, Thomas carried not only evidence, but a threat. The possibility that their authority could be undone by something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The ground was cruel. Roots snagged his feet, stones cut into his soles, and once he stumbled so hard he thought the vial might shatter against his ribs. Blood streaked his legs, and the hot breath of the dogs came close anew, for him to smell. Yet, by some twist of fortune, or perhaps a mercy too bitter to name, he broke free. The river appeared ahead, dark and rushing, and with no time to hesitate, he plunged waist deep into its current. The water seized him, pulling him away from the plantation's reach. Behind him, voices raged, a chorus of anger and fear carried on the night air. Ahead stretched silence, deep and uncertain. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of burden, of knowledge too heavy to discard. Betty's weapon was no longer hidden. It was proof, and proof had a way of demanding to be seen. Thomas staggered into Montgomery proper at the first light of dawn, his body a map of bruises, cuts, and exhaustion. His clothes were torn, his skin streaked with mud, but in his trembling hand he clutched the vial as though it were scripture, a relic too sacred and too damning to release. Every step through the waking streets carried the weight of urgency. He was not a fugitive seeking freedom. He was a messenger, a witness bringing evidence of a truth too long buried. His destination was clear, those whispered circles of abolitionist sympathizers who, in theory, longed for such revelations. Yet when Thomas placed the vial before them, expecting conviction to ignite, he was met not with triumph, but with hesitation. Their eyes widened, not in recognition, but in recoil. Too dangerous, they murmured among themselves, voices pitched low, as if the vial itself might overhear. Too grotesque to be believed. Even those who had dedicated their lives to opposing slavery shrank from the implications. A story of whips and chains, of families torn apart. They could endure and even rally behind. But the story Thomas carried, a woman enslaved, using her own body as a weapon, slipping death into the mouths of those who claimed ownership over her. This was something else entirely. It was unthinkable, obscene. It disrupted the tidy narratives of suffering and redemption they preferred to tell. Some voices urged him to destroy the evidence outright. They argued it would taint the cause, that sympathy would curdle into fear if the public ever learned of Betty's methods. Better to bury the truth once more than risk scandal. Others, more pointed, accused Thomas of fabrication. They eyed his bruises, his wild story of escape, the glass vial in his hand, and declared it the ravings of a desperate man seeking attention. Madness, they called it. And here, Irony curdled into tragedy. Thomas H. had carried proof across fields and rivers, endured pursuit and blood, only to discover that proof did not equal belief. Betty's rebellion was undeniable, yet society's refusal to acknowledge it became its own form of violence. In life, Betty had been silenced by power. In death, her legacy was threatened by polite denial. And Thomas, weary to the bone, had to confront a bitter question. Had he truly escaped the plantation's grip, or had its boundaries simply shifted, reappearing in the genteel parlors of civilization, disguised as civility and doubt? Now you must understand. The moment whispers of poison reached the ears of Montgomery's authorities, panic spread with the speed and hunger of wildfire. Fear has always been more contagious than truth, and in this case it leapt from parlor to courthouse, from overseer to planter, until the city itself hummed with dread. Poison was different from rebellion by blade or by fire. Poison was invisible, intimate, an assassin's weapon carried in silence and delivered in a cup of water, a loaf of bread, a kiss of trust. And so, a raid became not just likely, but inevitable. Armed men rode out under the banner of investigation, though their intent was less discovery than domination. They stormed the plantation with fury, tearing through cabins as if every corner might conceal treachery. Bedding was overturned, straw scattered across dirt floors, and the very earth itself was ripped apart with shovels, as though roots and clay might confess what mouths would not. Their brutality was not only practical but symbolic, a demonstration that no hidden place, no scrap of secrecy, was safe from the master's reach. What they uncovered chilled even the most hardened overseer. From beneath floorboards and inside makeshift caches, they drew forth small vials like the one Thomas had carried, their cloudy glass still clinging to powders that stung the nose with bitter almonds. Bundles of dried herbs, carefully bound, were scattered like relics of a hidden faith. Scraps of cloth bore faint, discolored stains, residue of concoctions prepared with deliberate patience. And from the enslaved themselves came testimonies, hesitant, fragmentary, never direct, yet heavy with implication. A cough, a sideways glance, a half-uttered admission, enough to confirm what had long been whispered. Betty's war had been real. The master's home, once polished and proud, was transformed into a grotesque museum of evidence. Investigators catalogued each suspicious trace, scribbling down inventories as though facts alone could cage the terror they felt. The air hung thick, not merely with the stench of overturned earth and fear, but with the larger dread of what the discoveries symbolized. If Betty, a woman enslaved and silenced, could orchestrate such a campaign of vengeance, what stopped others from following her path? In truth, the raid was never about justice or even clarity. It was about reasserting control, about reassuring the white South that the system, though shaken, had not cracked. But the evidence spoke for itself. Betty had taken the very thing that defined her oppression, her enforced intimacy, and forged it into a weapon. For a brief and startling moment, the mask slipped. The carefully constructed facade of Southern nobility cracked, and through those fractures, the truth began to seep. Reports circulated, quietly, cautiously, suggesting that the deaths of the master and his overseers had not been the dignified, inevitable consequence of fever or fate, but the calculated work of a woman they had sought to dominate. The revelation struck like a blow, tarnishing reputations that had once gleamed untouchable. Testimonies whispered of cruelty unrestrained, of punishments meted out with sadistic pleasure, of abuses endured in silence. For a moment, the grandeur of their names faltered, and the community glimpsed the rot beneath the veneer. But honesty is dangerous, and society has always been quick to repair its illusions. Almost immediately, the machinery of denial began its work. Newspapers softened the story, crafting language that preserved the hierarchy, while conceding just enough to explain the deaths. Betty, in these retellings, was not a strategist nor a rebel with vision. She was reimagined as a deranged woman, a tragic creature overcome by grief and lunacy. The narrative shifted subtly but decisively, stripping her of agency and replacing design with madness. To acknowledge her as deliberate, calculating, and brilliant was to admit a terrifying truth. that the very system they believed unshakable could be dismantled from within, not by armies or legislatures, but by a single enslaved woman wielding her wits as a weapon. That possibility was intolerable, and so the villains were revealed. In the parlors of polite society, the master and his overseers were mourned as victims of cruel chance, their legacies polished once again with words of pity and reverence. Their sins, if spoken of at all, were cloaked in euphemism or buried in silence. Yet in the quarters, in the hushed conversations carried on under cover of darkness, the memory endured differently. There, they were not martyrs, but predators, men who had finally been brought low by the very woman they believed powerless. The unmasking was fleeting. A flash of clarity quickly swept back into obscurity. But for those who had lived alongside Betty, for those who had known the weight of her vengeance, that brief glimpse was enough. They had seen the truth revealed, however briefly, and truth, once glimpsed, cannot ever fully be buried again. Here's the chilling ripple. Betty's story did not end at Montgomery's borders. Tales have a way of traveling faster than chains can contain them, and hers slipped into motion almost immediately. Rumors crept along the slave routes like smoke, winding their way through markets where traders haggled over human lives, carried in the hushed exchanges between those who had little power but much to lose. Sailors, too, became vessels for the tale, whispering it across decks and into crowded ports. By the time weeks had passed, Betty's name, or at least the shadow of it, had surfaced in Charleston, in New Orleans, even in the distant harbors of the Caribbean. Some claimed the whispers leapt across the Atlantic itself, reaching abolitionist circles in London and Paris, where the story was reshaped to fit the appetite of foreign ears. The core of the narrative, however, remained unchanged. An enslaved woman had transformed the very intimacy forced upon her into a weapon of annihilation. To the enslaved, it was a revelation, proof that power could be inverted, that vulnerability itself might become the sharpest blade. To planters, it was terror incarnate. Their paranoia deepened until it became routine cruelty. Bodies of enslaved women were searched with humiliating invasions, every touch of violation disguised as precaution. Meals were scrutinized, water tested, herbs confiscated. A climate of suspicion festered, poisoning the plantation economy in ways Betty herself could never have witnessed, but undoubtedly set into motion. In Europe, abolitionist circles seized on fragments of the tale, embellishing details to suit their audiences. Some pamphlets described her as a tragic figure driven to madness, others as a cunning avenger who exposed the hypocrisy of Southern gentility. Regardless of the version, the story returned always to the same core horror: an enslaved woman who had weaponized her imposed intimacy, turning the master's household into a site of fear. Some historians argue her methods inspired resistance movements we can no longer fully trace, their records erased or buried. Others suggest the whispers alone were enough to destabilize confidence, to cast a shadow of unease over transactions in slave markets and parlors alike. What remains certain is this: Betty's act was never just a local scandal. It was a warning shot, a tremor that rattled the fragile myth of white invulnerability. And though Montgomery tried to bury her beneath silence, rumor became her accomplice, carrying her shadow far beyond Alabama's soil. But silence, too, is powerful, and society wielded it like a weapon as sharp as any whip. The South could not afford to immortalize Betty as a revolutionary, for to do so would be to acknowledge not just her defiance but her brilliance, and that was intolerable. Instead, a systematic erasure began. Her name was carefully scrubbed from official records, her story excised from plantation ledgers and county archives. What could not be erased outright was distorted, her motives reduced to madness, her actions reframed as hysterical fits rather than deliberate rebellion. The same hands that had feared her in life now worked tirelessly to contain her in death. Churches thundered from their pulpits, preaching sermons that painted Betty not as a rebel, but as a cautionary tale of sin. She became, in their retellings, the embodiment of loose morality, a woman consumed by vice and therefore punished by God. Courts, too, conspired in her disappearance, sealing records that might have preserved her methods. Locking away testimony, burying evidence beneath the guise of order. Even abolitionists, who might have made her into a rallying figure, largely turned away. Martyrs of chains and whips they embraced readily, but Betty's weapon, intimacy, transfigured into annihilation, was too unsettling, too disruptive to the cause's carefully tended image of innocent suffering. And so, she was exiled to whispers. Yet here lies the paradox. In silencing Betty, they ensured her legend endured all the more hauntingly. What is buried does not vanish. It lingers, festering like an unhealed wound. Every overseer who forced his will upon a woman afterward carried, whether admitted or not, the flicker of dread that death itself might be hidden in that act. Every master who dismissed the enslaved as powerless had to reckon, privately, with the knowledge that power is never absolute, that even the most Enslaved dominion could be inverted. Betty's silence was not her erasure. It was her echo. It rattled through quarters and cabins, through whispered stories passed down in secret, through the unspoken fears that lingered in Southern households for generations. It was less a disappearance than a haunting, a warning that could not be spoken aloud, yet could never entirely be denied. Betty's own fate is shrouded in shadows, as though history itself conspired to blur the edges of her ending. Some accounts, cold, efficient, and likely official, claim she was executed swiftly. They say she was marched out before dawn, a rope slung over a branch or a hastily built gallows, her body swinging in silence before the sun even rose. No ceremony, no record, no marker in the soil. Only the swift erasure of one who had unsettled the natural order. Others whisper darker versions, that she was not killed quickly, but broken slowly. Her confession dragged from her under torture, her body beaten until there was nothing left to bury. These stories, passed in low tones, emphasize cruelty not as justice, but as vengeance. A system lashing out in desperation to prove it still held dominion over her even in death. And yet, there are fragments, tantalizing, improbable, but persistent, that tell another story. They suggest that amid the chaos of the raid, Betty slipped away, spirited into the hidden corridors of the underground networks that ferried fugitives north. Some imagine her living under another name in Ohio, or even across the border in Canada. A ghost who walked among the free while her legend grew in the South. This possibility, unverifiable though it may be, is perhaps the most haunting of all. For if she did survive, then her silence was not death, but choice. A decision to let rumor and fear do the work of memory. Thomas Reed, the obsessive truth-seeker who risked everything to expose her story, fared little better. In some accounts he was discredited and ridiculed, branded insane, his precious vial dismissed as delusion. In others, he met a darker end, his body found floating in a river, bruised, the vial gone, his discovery erased as cleanly as Betty's name. Whether by slander or by murder, his fate serves as a reminder that proof itself is dangerous, that truth, too sharp, is often smothered. The overseers and master required no further fate. Betty had already claimed them. But the story as a whole denies us closure. It resists certainty, leaving us only with questions and fragments. And perhaps that is what makes it so enduring, so chilling. Betty's legacy survives not in clarity, but in mystery, her shadow stretching precisely because it cannot be pinned down. This is where the story turns from history into warning, where the past refuses to remain buried and instead rises like a specter to confront the present. Betty's act was never merely about vengeance, though vengeance ran hot at its core. It was something more destabilizing, an inversion of power so complete, so intimate, that society could not even bring itself to name it aloud. By weaponizing the very vulnerability forced upon her, she exposed the fragility of a system that prided itself on domination. She revealed, with terrifying clarity, that beneath all its pageantry and violence, slavery was not unbreakable. It was brittle. Even within the body deemed most powerless lay the capacity for annihilation. That realization terrified those who benefited from the system more than any rebellion armed with guns or torches ever could. Now, you have to understand, this is not a tale that lends itself to glorification or neat moral lessons. It resists being sanitized into triumph. It is brutal, grotesque, soaked in blood, violation, and silence. Betty's methods were born not from freedom, but from desperation, from being forced into intimacy and then seizing that intimacy as a blade. To tell her story truthfully is to wade through discomfort, to confront the ways oppression deforms survival into something that cannot fit within heroic archetypes. And yet, it is also a testament, proof that even under the most unthinkable oppression, human ingenuity will claw for expression. Betty's legacy is not clean, and perhaps that is why it lingers so stubbornly. She does not fit the mold of a martyr or saint. She is not heroic in the traditional sense, wrapped in purity or righteousness. Instead, her memory carries something darker, sharper, a reminder that when people are denied their humanity, when every avenue of justice is sealed, they will still find ways, terrible, horrific ways, to reclaim agency. Her story hangs in the air like a ghost, refusing to be exorcised. It asks questions we would rather not face. Can survival be separated from rebellion? Can defiance ever be wholly innocent when it is carved out of suffering? Betty's silence, her mystery, forces us to admit that the answers may never be clean. And maybe that, too, is the warning. So I leave you with this. Could something like this happen today? That is not a question posed for shock value, but for reflection. Would we even see it coming, or would we, like Montgomery's leaders, dismiss the possibility until the evidence was undeniable, until the bodies began to fall and the silence itself cracked open? History has a way of circling back, repeating itself, first in whispers, subtle and almost ignorable, before it builds into something loud enough to shake foundations. Betty Peters' story is precisely that. A scream buried in silence, a cry of rebellion muffled by those who feared it, but one that refuses to stay hidden forever. Even across centuries, it claws its way back into our awareness, asking to be heard, demanding to be reckoned with. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Betty's story is not simply about the past. It is about the patterns of power and denial that persist. Whenever domination insists on its permanence, whenever systems thrive on silencing the vulnerable, there exists the potential for eruption in forms that society does not anticipate and does not wish to name. Betty's act was horrifying, yes, but it was also clarifying. It revealed what happens when humanity is stripped away and survival must be reinvented in whatever form remains. To turn from her story is to turn from that lesson. If you followed this investigation to its end, then you understand why it matters. These are the stories history tried hardest to erase, the ones sanded down until they were unrecognizable, the ones buried under silence because they unsettled too deeply. That's why Echoes of Truth exists, to exhume what was meant to stay hidden, to remind us that the shadows of the past never vanish entirely. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the work of remembering is not done. Share your thoughts in the comments. What does Betty's rebellion mean to you? Was it vengeance, justice, survival, or something beyond those words? And prepare yourself for the next descent into shadow, because next time we'll uncover another tale, one where loyalty, power, and betrayal converged in ways equally chilling, equally instructive. But for now, hold on to this. Silence is never empty. Sometimes silence carries the weight of centuries. Sometimes silence carries poison.